Hello, welcome to Guru Performance ISSN Diploma Research Review. In this video, I'll be providing an overview of the recent paper, Low Carbohydrate, High Fat Diet Impairs Exercise Economy and Negates the Performance Benefit from Intensified Training in Elite Race Walkers by Burke et al. 2017. A mistakenly accepted belief towards going low carb and high in fat hasn't just skewed some people's perception of energy balance regulation. It has also coloured their view of what they consider the most logical conclusions from what a group of pioneering Scandinavian researchers taught us more than half a century ago, which is that with low glycogen stores induced by both exercise and diet, sub-maximal exercise performance is impaired. In a nutshell, carbs are king when it comes to increasing exercise capacity. It is well established in exercise metabolism that the greatest determinant of energy production during exercise comes from carbohydrates and fats. These substrates fuel exercise, and their magnitude of use is dictated by exercise intensity, nutrient availability, which is established by the composition of the diet consumed by an individual over the preceding few days, the duration of exercise, and the training status of the individual. Now, as this graph demonstrates, as exercise intensity increases, the amount of carbohydrates metabolized to produce energy increases too, while the contribution of fats to energy production decreases. However, nutrient availability is by far the most potent facet in changing the regulation of energy use during exercise. As a result, going low carb is implemented in a bid to shift substrate use towards fat oxidation. In the presence of reduced glycogen availability before exercise, which occurs when implementing a low-carb diet, during exercise there is an increased uptake of plasma-free fatty acids as well as adrenaline concentrations. As a result, favouring conditions for heightened fat oxidation and fat mobilization. For instance, just 3 days of a low-carb, high-fat diet upregulates pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase and downregulates pyruvate dehydrogenase activity. This dial down of PDH is important to appreciate as a maximal PDH activity increases following moderate and high intensity aerobic training and is a key regulator of carbohydrate oxidation. Now, as a result of the turning off of PDH, substrate use during exercise increases towards the utilization of fat oxidation, with endogenous stores, even in the leanest athletes, being far more abundant in fat than carbohydrate stores. Some scientists think that a low-carb diet strategy will be optimal for delaying fatigue and performance due to its ability to negate the issue of relying on the rate-limited storage of energy as carbohydrates. Recently, going keto has been lauded as a dieting ploy to maximize this strategy, whereby less than 50 grams of carbohydrates are consumed, with 75 to 80% of the energy from the diet coming from dietary fat, in a bid to shift the body towards ketone production and increase fat utilization by the muscle during exercise and improve performance capacity. Now, in a bid to test this theory, researchers set out a 3-week intensified training program for world-class elite race walkers, whereby 3 different dietary conditions were measured. Now, race walking may be unfamiliar to many of you, but just to provide you with some context on the standard of these participants, 22 of the 29 data points came from athletes who were selected to either compete at the World Championships or at the Rio Olympics the following year. Now, in terms of how fast these guys are moving, the qualifying time for the Rio Olympics was 84 minutes for a 20k, which comes to an 8.9 miles per hour. Impressive. The 3 dietary conditions were a standardized traditional high-carb diet, a diet commonly pushed by sports nutrition guidelines until recent years. 2, a low-carb, high-fat diet with less than 50 grams of carbohydrates per day, 75 to 80% of calories from dietary fat, and the rest is protein. Then thirdly, a more up-to-date periodized approach to sports nutrition with carbohydrate manipulation dependent on the intensity of exercise. For instance, some training sessions during the 3-week study were undertaken with low glycogen stores, whereas other sessions were taken with high glycogen stores. in essence adhering to the sentiments of this great paper, Fueling for the Work Required. Now this was interesting, as comparing the old school to the new school of carbohydrate recommendations alongside a theoretical model of a low-carb diet hasn't ever been compared before in elite athletes. So these athletes were tested in 3 different settings, at baseline and then at the end of 3 weeks. Firstly, they were tested in the laboratory, whereby the athlete's VO2 peak, which refers to the amount of oxygen that an individual can utilize during intense or maximal exercise, and walking economy, which refers to the oxygen cost to generate a given walking speed, were measured. Secondly, on the track, whereby an IAAF sanctioned 10k race with a financial reward for the winner was staged. And then finally, a lab field test combination, whereby during a 25k race, segments of the race were interchanged from the track to the treadmill in the lab in a bid to measure fuel use and assess circulating blood glucose, lactate, and ketone production. So what happened? Firstly, the very low carb group produced resting rates of endogenous ketone production of 1.8 millimoles per litre, highlighting a state of ketosis. Subsequently, they increased fat oxidation throughout the interventions, with fat burning rates peaking at 1.57 grams per minute at 80% VO2 peak, which is twice the rate of the other groups. In fact, some of the individuals attained fat oxidation rates over 1.9 grams per minute, among the highest recorded in sports performance literature. Also, regardless of diet conditions, all groups increased peak aerobic capacity during the 3-week intervention, highlighting that during the 3 weeks, all subjects benefited from the program. In the laboratory test, both the high carb and periodized carb groups maintained their exercise efficiency, whereas in the low carb group, an increase in relative oxygen cost for exercise was increased in both the faster pace, 14 to 50k per hour, and the slower pace of 12 to 13k per hour. In the 10k race, the high carb and the periodized carb groups completed the race 6.6% and 5.3% faster than the previous attempt at the beginning of the study. However, there was no difference in the low carb group between race attempts. But remember, we are talking about means here. In fact, some elite race walkers did see an improvement going low carb, as they ranged from negative 8.5% reduction in performance time to a 5.3% improvement in performance time in the 10k race. In the lab field combination assessment, the data leaned towards an increase in heart rate in the low carb group, whereas a decrease in the high carb and periodized carb groups. There also tended to be a greater increase in the rate of perceived exertion for the exercise bout, an increase in oxygen uptake in the low carb group compared to the high carb and periodized carb conditions. So what's the key take home here? Well, implementing a very low carb diet certainly does increase the rates of fat usage during exercise performance and does permit the improvement of VO2 peak amongst a structured 3-week training program. Also, some individuals may fare well on a low carb diet competing in elite race walking conditions. However, the main findings highlight consuming a very low carbohydrate diet in elite race walkers increases the oxygen cost of high intensity exercise, particularly at intensities that real world elite race walkers compete at. Compared to training in a state of high carb or periodized carbohydrate intake in elite race walkers, opting to go keto in a bid to change substrate use impaired their competitive performance, increased their perceived effort and heart rate. Often we can all suffer from the magpie effect, whereby a plausible mechanism looks shiny, so shiny in fact that it blinds us to our outlook on what we've been taught in over 50 years of exercise physiology research. Fundamentally, in the presence of sufficient glycogen, we know that the use of ATP from carbohydrate metabolism through aerobic breakdown occurs at twice the rate of fat oxidation. For instance, aerobic breakdown of glucose demands 26 reactions, permitting the TCA cycle is used twice, and within the region of about 100 reactions for complete fatty acid oxidation. It's clear to see that due to the greater step-by-step process of energy production, that the yield of energy occurs at a slower rate with fat metabolism. In fact, we've known the increase in oxygen cost of using fat rather than carbohydrate for energy for around a century. We also know that going low carb turns off PDH activity, and as I mentioned earlier, PDH activity is a key regulator for carbohydrate oxidation and high intensity performance. This study demonstrates what happens after 20 minutes of moderate intensity exercise on a fat-adapted diet compared to a high carbohydrate diet. Essentially, PDH activity reduces, which means carbohydrate oxidation reduces, switching the cell to use fats for oxidation. Now, you know fat oxidation yields a slower rate of ATP resynthesis, and PDH activity is essential for high intensity performance. So let's imagine the following scenario. An endurance athlete is in the final leg of their race and it demands a sprint finish. Now, the winner of the sprint finish will likely come down to the individual who has the substrate left to increase high intensity capacity that wins the race. At that point, you want PDH activity to be high, as that's when you use carbohydrates to fuel high intensity exercise performance. In this study, they had the subject sprint 150% of their peak power output, alongside measuring PDH activity. Now, as you can see in the high carb condition, PDH activity was higher compared to the fat-adapted diet. Thus, you want sufficient carbohydrates available if competing to maximize exercise capacity. Okay, so final point. So when tailoring sports nutrition recommendations in the context of competitive endurance performance, what we've been taught over a century of exercise physiology research still reigns true to this very day, which is this: carbohydrates are essential for maximizing endurance performance. Okay, so for further reading, for mechanisms behind fat and carbohydrate utilization during exercise, or how to fuel exercise performance away from competition, I'd advise the following textbooks and papers. And finally, a special thanks to Dr. James Morton, researcher and performance nutritionist, who has taught me so much about biochemistry through the ISSN Diploma. He is truly a leader in the field of sports nutrition. Okay, thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you found it useful, and we look forward to seeing you very soon.